What are you saying?
Okay, so Erev Tov, I'm gonna remind us a little bit about what we did previously, and then we will continue. And by the way, we are nearing the completion of this, of what we're going to do about this topic, start thinking about topics for further discussion. Write to me, talk to me, maybe we'll come up with some interesting ideas. I have some things written down, but if someone has something that you want to suggest to us, we'll be happy to hear about it. Okay, so what we saw last time was a very harsh attitude, which is put down by Rav Moshe Feinstein towards the non-Orthodox movements. A very harsh, very strict. I would say, I'm not going to go back into all the details, mostly accepted within Orthodox circles. Keep veering far away, not cooperating with, not even having someone like teach or have a position in even teaching Torah in a non-Orthodox institution or community, and also in an Orthodox community, and you have to choose between the two. A lot of things that were very harsh in separation between the communities. And one of the harsh points that he made was, I'm being careful again, not comparing them to idolatry, to Avodah Zarah, but comparing how we have to veer far away from Avodah Zarah, taking that halachic concept and saying we have to move ourselves, steer ourselves far away from any cooperation with these movements. That was a basis of a lot of the things that he said. And so he makes a separation, which is very much accepted, as I say, in Orthodox circles, between non-religious people, what we call in Israel chilonim, who are tinokot shenishbu, and we're going to use that term again today. Tinokot shenishbu in Hebrew is the halachic term. I think the wording of it comes from, actually it's in the Gemara, but using it for certain groups, I think comes from the Rambam. Tinokot shenishbu are people who were taken captive as children, as babies or as young children, and grew up without being taught about Judaism. So people are non-religious, get this kind of attitude of tinok. Okay, they were never taught any better, so we're more mild in our attitude towards them. Whereas conservative or reform have a different position, have an emunah, which is different than that of the traditional Torah, and therefore the attitude towards them is much more harsh. I just spoke, you might remember, some of you, that we had a nephew who was injured in Gaza about half a year ago. He was hit bad in his shoulder, and he's still working on that. But he could have not survived, chas v'chalila. He was hit in his lung, and that could be life-threatening. And he was touch and go. And thank God they got him to the hospital, and he was taken care of in the hospital. And we met this last week at his Thanksgiving party, Mesibat Hodaya, to thank Hashem for his being saved with his wife and his two kids and all his brothers and sisters and his father, who is Osher's brother. And one of his brothers, all the children were there, all the siblings were there. One of his brothers is a rabbi in a certain yeshiva, has a different outlook than mine, I would say. But he's a great guy. We talk, we like to exchange views. And he said, maybe he'll come to us for a Shabbat in Ra'anana. In Kinor David, I said to him, absolutely, you're very welcome. Just, you might not be comfortable with everything. You said, well, you think I don't know you? I know you do all kinds of things. But I trust you that what you do is within certain guidelines. And, I'll be happy to see and discuss with you. And then we started talking about certain things. He told me about an event where he met with, as part of the things going on in Israeli society between different groups to create unity. They met with a certain non-religious group. And he was telling me about the difficulties in the meeting and how everything is so super sensitive and it's hard to talk. Everybody wants to be friendly and unified, but you don't want to hide your opinions or just be, everybody be nice to one another and not say anything. And at some point he was honest towards, there was one reform representative in what was called the non-religious group. And he said, he was honest that it's easier for him to be understanding and positive towards non-religious people more than towards her, because they don't represent a threat to Judaism. They're just not religious. Whereas she presents a threat to Judaism because she has a different belief. And I said to him on the spot, I don't agree with you. I said to him, I don't agree. I think that being disconnected from Jewish content, from tefillah, from Shabbat, from all kinds of things is worse, a greater danger than someone who has a different religious perspective than mine, even though I will be very firm in my disagreement with her. But I think that having no connection and no content is more dangerous. We didn't develop it. We were standing probably at about dessert when everything was ending. But if he comes for a Shabbat, maybe we'll have a chance to talk about it. But I'm saying this, what he was representing, what he was presenting is very much accepted in religious circles, in Orthodox religious circles in Israel. It's easier to be understanding and containing, inclusive of people who are not religious, who call themselves Ani Chiloni, because they don't present a threat. This is the way of looking at it. Whereas a person who's conservative or reform, that's a threat, that's a competition. So it's people find it more difficult or are more harsh because this person presents a danger to Judaism. So I am expressing a little bit of my own attitude, but I'm saying that this comes from Rav Moshe Feinstein, and it's very much accepted in Orthodox circles in Israel. And we started discussing, is there another option? And we quoted Rav Yaakov Ariel, who held several leading positions and is still considered a leading Talmid Chacham, a leading rabbi and halachic decision maker, posek, within Tzionut Datit, within religious Zionism in Israel. And he makes a distinction between the movements and the leaders and the people. And he says about reform and conservative individuals, the idea of Tinok Shenishba, the same idea that we said about people who are non-religious, because usually the case is that they didn't grow up with anything else. This is what they grew up with. They grew up in a reform community, in a conservative community. This is what they were taught. This is what they know. And we shouldn't be any more harsh towards them or less inclusive towards them than we are towards someone who is non-religious. And so there is, call it a dissenting opinion or another opinion within Orthodox rabbis, but it's hard to find others who say this, and it's not the prevalent attitude that people take generally. And now I'd like to bring what Rav Ronen Luvitz says. He's the Rav of Nir Etzion. He analyzes why did this happen, and he has a very interesting idea about this, and this is what we're going to see today, and love to hear what you have to say about it. He looks back historically to the processes that happened in the United States, and he claims that this is a result of processes in the past, and he claims that today we're in a different place, and I'll explain. So he says the following. Historically, the Jews came to America and grew in numbers in 18th, 19th centuries, the turn of the 20th century. And generally, there was not a lot of, one second, I think this will be helpful. Okay, I think it'll be better this way. Okay, if you want to speak up, you can unmute yourselves. Okay, so Judaism was very weak in the United States. It did not have a strong basis in the 19th century. That was the strong development of the non-Orthodox movements. Orthodoxy was not very strong, was very weak. In the 20th century, maybe the end of the 19th century, maybe the beginning of the 20th century, I look at my own grandparents, maybe some came even before World War I, mostly after World War I, and certainly after World War II. that's when Orthodoxy started growing stronger in the United States. But it was weak. The big numbers, the strong movements were in the conservative and reform movements. He brings a survey from 1971. 11% of the Jews who identified as Jews identified as Orthodox, 42% conservative, 33% reform. Does that reach 100? I'm not sure. Apparently not.
Missing 14.
Yeah, so we're missing a few Jews. Yeah, but you understand that given these numbers and the fact that the non-Orthodox communities were growing and were getting stronger and stronger, and the Orthodox movements were not getting strong in that way, created a feeling of an atmosphere of a threat towards Orthodoxy. Orthodoxy felt threatened by the non-Orthodox movements. And therefore, Harav Olovitz claims this was a way of fighting back. This was a way of trying to build up big walls and keep ourselves, at least keep ourselves as much as possible within the constraints, within the framework of Orthodoxy. Many of the original conservative or reform rabbis grew up Orthodox, came from the Orthodox community, and therefore there was a connection. There was also a personal connection and a personal, people were familiar with one another, maybe even a feeling of discomfort on both sides, to go to war, so to speak, not up in arms, but to go to struggle powerfully against one another. Whereas as the non-Orthodox movements grew, they created their own institutions, and their rabbis grew up within their own communities and weren't coming from Orthodox circles, so that made the communities more distanced than one another. The original non-Orthodox communities were also made up of people who came from Europe and in America became non-Orthodox and were influenced by American culture and society, but still had, in their kishkas, they still had their Orthodox upbringing and all kinds of attitudes and things like that. The next generation grew up in liberal America with individualism, liberalism, human rights, individualism, equality, not to mention the F word. You know what the F word is? The F word is feminism and these kind of things. So they had a totally different outlook. Their whole mindset is totally different. And you try to put that with people whose upbringing has moved from Europe to North America, but is still very traditional, very holy in the tradition of Judaism. And so the distance, once again, grows more and more. Another interesting example is that certainly in this first half of the 20th century, I think well into the second half of the 20th century, there were many Orthodox rabbis who in their own personal individual lives were Orthodox, who went to be rabbis, I don't think in reform communities, but certainly in conservative communities, whether they had no mechitza, but separate seating or whatever it was, but this is where they found that they could still teach and have influence and so on. Some very prominent Orthodox individuals, Talmidei Chachamim, very knowledgeable, learned people, taught in JTS, in the conservative seminary, until, and again, this is part of the process, we discussed and we described in the past, it's been a while, but we discussed the process of how more and more decisions were made that moved the conservative movement farther and farther to the left. And each time they made a big step, I'm not taking the terms left and right as something that's sacred, but you know what I'm talking about. And every time they took a step in that direction, there were rabbis who left the movement, whether it was to ordain women, whether it was to accept gays, whether it was to drive on Shabbat to shul, every kind of decision like this. it pushed some Orthodox people who were kind of borderline, or still maybe they were Orthodox in their own individual actions and their own individual halacha keeping of mitzvot, but still like teaching in conservative circles and so on, maybe because it was more open and had more free thinking, but they had to leave. They couldn't contain it. At the same time, possibly as a reaction to all of this, the Orthodoxy in the United States started moving more to the right. So if you see what's happening, they're moving, keep on moving. It's like an earthquake, and you have, things are moving farther and farther away from one another all the time. And once this happened, it created a situation where everything was very far from one another, and you felt the need to defend yourself, to defend your position, to defend your community, to put up big blocks that keep the threat away from you on the one hand, and you feel distanced and estranged from the people on the other side of those blocks and walls that you've created. And this created this distancing that we see in Rav Moshe Feinstein's attitude. And then claims Rav Ronen Lubitz, let's look where we are today. In this article or small booklet was written a few years ago, maybe 2020, maybe a little bit before, a little bit after, certainly not much earlier than 2020, but he says, let's look where we are today. The conservative movements in the United States, I don't mean to make, to belittle anyone, but they're small, they're not growing, they're dwindling. I think there's more reform than conservative today. It's kind of moved to the extremes. It's either reform or Orthodox. There are conservative communities. If we mentioned before the couple that just got married, they met at the bar mitzvah of a couple who he was connected to the man, she was connected to the woman. They met at their bar mitzvah. At the wedding, the parents came up to me to say, we were in shul on Shabbat at Kinol David. They met at our grandson's bar mitzvah and so on. They were very happy to say this. And they are part of a conservative community in Manhattan. And their two sons came running up to say, the older one said, they met at my bar mitzvah. And the younger one said, and he proposed a day before my bar mitzvah. So this family was enjoying being the shidduch between these two people, and they're part of a conservative community, but these are not the big numbers. And once again, people, even more than in the past, they grew up wherever they grew up. They did not have opportunities to meet other options. This is what they were taught. This is what they know. Some of them, whatever little bit of knowledge they have about Judaism comes from those movements. This is the Judaism that they were taught. I mean, they know there's something else, but they were never taught anything else. And it's not very deep and extensive. So why not take the Tinok Shenishba attitude and be more lenient and more inclusive? He claims that is more important today, more appropriate today. And also put back into the equation that if we have moved so far if once we have moved so far away from one another, rather than keep up the very negative attitude towards one another's movements or even as individuals, maybe we have created such a separation between the different movements and the different attitudes that there is a need now to bring Am Yisrael to strengthen the unity and bring us closer to one another. And dafka, because we have made very clear the distinctions and the separations between the movements, maybe it's important to give strength to being together and towards the unity. Ilana, I'm sorry, I missed it. It went. Let me take a look at what you wrote. Ilana wrote to us 675 versus
that there are
800.
more Reform synagogues than conservative synagogues today in the US. And indeed, when I just Googled it, that's exactly what it says. 675 conservative congregations and 850 Reform congregations in the US. Now, I don't know where they're spread out, and
Right,
Same in Europe.
that's just a quick look.
right. By the way, I'm surprised by the numbers, meaning I thought it would be less than that. 850 Reform communities is more than I would have expected. All
Across
over
the
the
US,
US.
and it doesn't tell you the size of the
Right, I understand.
population of the congregation.
Right,
It's,
but
it's just a very gross.
yeah. What I would like to see is if someone has the statistic of compare these numbers to, let's say, 1970. You know,
No
Do remember
question.
Also, do remember also that the US is not the only Jewish community in the world. The community in Canada, for example, is more heavily skewed towards Orthodoxy than in the US, I think, and perhaps I think also in Europe.
but are there Reform and conservative communities in
Yeah, yes,
Canada?
certainly.
But the numbers,
are different from the US.
yeah.
They
And then
are, but much
The
smaller
number
than the US.
of Orthodox communities, the proportion of Orthodox community in the US compared to Reform and conservative.
it's still probably smaller in number, but the movement is constantly in favor of Orthodoxy and certainly not towards conservative. People move more to the extremes. And in general, Orthodoxy in the United States now feels less threatened. I mean, threatened by the modern world, by liberalism, yes, but still strong and moving more to the right rather than more to the left. And myself, I've said this in the past, I don't like being called liberal, and I don't call myself liberal. I like to be complex and open and listening and inclusive. But I find myself in the world, in the rabbinic world, in the religious Orthodox world, not the Haredi, the modern religious, modern Orthodox, Dati Tzioni in Israel. I find myself very often struggling. Part of what the work I do is to struggle in favor of more lenient, more inclusive, more open-minded Orthodoxy, because so much of it is moving more to the right. And so I do see it here as well, and also in the United States, which I'm not very familiar with, but I do see it there. Michael.
So living in a fairly small Jewish community that has really not grown even since I was a young person. There's maybe 4,000 people that identify as Jews in the Fort Worth area. And there's, yeah. I mean, Dallas is far different. There's probably 100,000, not so far away.
Dallas more than Houston?
No, Houston, I think, is still the biggest. But Dallas has really built infrastructure and brought in Orthodox rabbis and a kollel, and the number of Orthodox institutions, including schools, and yeshivot, has just mushroomed in the last 20 years. It's remarkable.
Wow.
Fort Worth just never put the money into it, and
shut down their day school.
they seem happy with basically an elementary school approach to learning. That as long as you've got a preschool that calls itself Jewish, that's good enough. It's quite remarkable. But the point that I was going to make is that the people don't seem to see a great big difference between the conservative institutions and the Reform institutions. They're more interested in the personalities. If they like the rabbi and the teachers in one place, they'll move. They'll go. They're being taught basically the same thing in both places. The conservative movement has maybe more Hebrew in the services. They'll have a little bit more emphasis on certain things. But as far as the philosophy, it's not so different. And they go where they're comfortable. I was going to make one point and ask the rabbi a question. Earlier, you were talking about
What is it?
Well, go ahead, Michael.
You were
Mhm.
talking about the reform versus the non-religious at all.
Yeah.
And should you reach out to one versus the other? And it seems to me that the biggest danger throughout history to the Jewish communities was always assimilation. I mean, Jews always had big families, and yet there's still a static number of Jews in the world. So where they go, they assimilated. In Europe, a lot of the communities were basically shtetls, to where assimilation into the surrounding community wasn't as easy. It's been much easier in the United States. So in Israel, is Israel the shtetl of today? Does the fact that even the non-religious live in a culture that feels Jewish, does that keep people from truly assimilating and disappearing? They've got the luxury of living in Jewish culture without having to do a whole lot that's Jewish. What do you think?
Okay, first of all, I'd like to address what you said before about the choosing a community based on how much you like the rabbi.
Yeah.
First of all, yes, I do think that's it's a valuable trait to have, to be a likable person and to be able to bring people or mekarev people because you're being nice and because you're being moral and all kinds of other things that go with being a nice person. Of course, it's not enough, and I wouldn't want that to be the only or the main consideration, but I understand that it's valuable. And I think that some people in the world, whether they're rabbis or not, in other positions and important places, should have that in mind. And it's not enough to be, to believe that what you're doing is the correct thing to do. You also have to be, first of all, you should be a nice person in any case, but also in order to pragmatically advance your ideas and the things you want, your social influence. Yes, I do think that's an important factor. And some people miss that in a sad way. Relating to your question about Israel as a shtetl, first of all, I'd like to look at history. What I mean to say about this, and I learned this from Rav Yaakov Ariel, who I mentioned before. Sometimes some religious non-Zionist people accuse the state of Israel to be the one who caused people to move away from religion, because we bring them to Israel and it's not a religious country. The laws are not made according to halacha and things like that. And sometimes you have to admit that it's true that sometimes they brought people and directed them, olim chadashim, and directed them to non-religious places. But that's not the big numbers, and that's not a very relevant threat today, and not in an immediate way. But if you look at Europe in the 19th century, the Jews in Europe in the 19th century, after Enlightenment and Emancipation, the assimilation was terrible, and Jews were looking for, either they didn't want to have anything to do with Judaism, or they moved to the other extreme and closing up behind, like I said before, even bigger walls to remain Orthodox and try to be disconnected from everything that was going on around them, or to create different kinds of Jewish movements that could be, in some way, could work with what was happening in the world around them. So that could be reform, or that can be Bundist, or that can be, what were they called in Hungary? There's another kind of, not reform, they have a different name in Hungary. What? Neologim, neologists. Yeah, okay, so these are all kinds of these kinds of movements. And then there's Zionism. Zionism, amongst other things, is a movement that I think it's pretty clear that part of what created modern Zionism, I mean, Zionism is not a new idea, but the creation of a modern Zionist movement was because of a need to keep a Jewish framework in a world that was not religious. If you were religious, you had a Jewish framework to live within. If you were not religious and didn't care about being Jewish, you could assimilate, intermarry, and disappear. If you wanted, if you were connected to Judaism and to the Jewish people, and you weren't religious or weren't very religious, Zionism was a savior for you. And you had a goal and you had an ideal, an ideology. And I think that very much created Zionism. And the big numbers and the strong energy of modern Zionism was from non-religious people. The first people who spoke about Zionism were rabbis. But it gained strength when Herzl took the lead, and the big numbers were not religious. And I think that's the reason, because if you were religious, you didn't need it. And if you were non-religious, but you wanted to be Jewish, this was the way to do it and create a Jewish state in a place where Jews will gather. And you look at Europe, those who were not Zionist and not religious, they disappeared, they're gone. There's nothing left of them. I mean, there's maybe some small Reform communities in Europe, but not in significant numbers. And most of those Jews are sadly disappeared. If you were Zionist and you came to Israel, your grandchildren, great-grandchildren are almost all Jewish. If you were religious and your children and grandchildren remained religious, then your great-grandchildren are Jewish. And it's not the state of Israel that made people non-religious. It's the state of Israel that saved non-religious people from disappearing from the Jewish people. But decades have passed. Where are we today? The numbers are not absolutely clear, but first of all, as we drift away, as people become less and less knowledgeable about their Judaism, they grow up in Israel, they know a little bit about Chagim, things like that, yes, that keeps more than 50% Jewish, traditional, marrying Jews, whether that's because that's who they meet or because they want to marry Jews, all kinds of reasons. But there's a drifting away. There are people who leave the country who are not interested. If you don't have a Jewish backbone, how much motivation do you have to be here and struggle with all the difficulties? There are difficulties. We can't deny it. And today, the numbers of intermarriages happening in Israel might be the highest number quoted today is about 10%. 10% is a big number. It's nowhere near any other Jewish community around the world. There is no other Jewish community in the world that has numbers that are anywhere near as low as 10%. They can be 90% or 50%, but they're nowhere near 10%. In Israel, it's only 10%, but it's up from being 1 or 2 or 3% a couple of decades ago. And that worries me, and I'm afraid of that. And therefore, that's part of what pushes me to decide that it's important for people to have some Jewish traditional identity. I believe, I disagree with Reform or conservative decisions, but I don't think that it's constructive. I don't think that it's right. I don't think that the price we pay in the lack of unity and the friction between different groups, and I don't think that pragmatically it's working, proves itself to be very negative towards other people. It would be interesting for me to know if there's a statistic about how many intermarriages are the Reform communities in Israel. I think, this is my feeling, I don't have statistics, from my acquaintance with different things going on, communities, Reform rabbis and things like that. I think they're growing, not getting smaller. I think they're getting bigger. There are more communities. I think it's a sign of Israelis looking for something Jewish, but yes, this does express my own opinion, but watered down. They don't want something too rigorous, too difficult, too far away from modern values that they believe in, liberalism and things like that. Having a Reform community where they can go X times a year or have a bar mitzvah and things like that, for some Israelis, is attractive. And rather than tell them, horrible, don't go there, so they won't go there, but they also won't go to an Orthodox community, I will be telling them, so don't have any Jewish content in your life. I don't think that's constructive. And that's one of the reasons why I don't think we should be doing that. And that's my take, I think, in answer to your question.
Can I give you
Right.
an example of
Yes.
what happened in France? Because it's very, very different what we have today in France. And I don't know, again, the figures and the statistics for the different movements. The reform movement, like we call it liberal in France, the liberal movement is not so powerful. So there are some Jews in this community, and we have more Orthodox communities in France. But just to speak about this unity between the communities, the Chabad movement made a really, really good job for several decades, just to bring back even not so religious people, Jewish people, bring back them to a community. So they are really open-minded, they accept everyone, and they try to bring even the less religious people to belong to a community, and they do an extraordinary job to try to gather all those community, and even if the number of Jewish is less and less in France, it remains the biggest community in Europe, at least in Western Europe. And we have also assimilation, and we have people that made Aliyah and also things, but they succeeded in bringing back to religion, even some Jewish that were they didn't grow up in a Jewish tradition and all those things, and I think this is a very good example of how an Orthodox movement can bring back the Jewish and put together this unity in a country like France, for example.
I want to learn something positive from Chabad. Chabad is diverse. Not all Chabad in the world are the same. And sometimes there are differences between Chabad outside of Israel and Chabad in Israel, but not everyone. They're also very diverse. In Ra'anana now, I don't know if there are 5 or 6 or 7 Chabad centers, and probably they have
At
their
least
disagreements.
3 that I've counted,
Yeah.
all over the place.
They might even have certain struggles between themselves, but what I've seen in many of the Chabad places, both in Israel and certainly outside of Israel, is acceptance of someone who wants to have a connection to Judaism. Certainly they would want to influence them to become religious. And I absolutely agree with that. I would want to influence anyone who's not religious to become religious. But at the same time, and this is where I identify with Chabad, having the attitude of I accept you for whatever you are, because you want a certain connection with Judaism, and come, participate with us, whether it's Yom Kippur or Purim or whatever, as much as you want, and what you don't want, I'm just going to be your brother and your friend. I think that does more for Judaism than fighting against people who want something different than me. And again, some people in Orthodoxy are kind of pushing for not all or nothing, in the sense of if you don't become totally religious in my way, I'm not going to be your friend, but being pushy in the direction of become something that I would want you to be. And instead of encouraging people in some ways, I'm not in all cases, sometimes it works, but in many cases, rather than bringing people closer in, it keeps them away because they don't want to be the person you want them to be. And accepting that a person wants Judaism on a very small, superficial, watered down level, whatever you want to call it, but they want that connection. If you give them that connection, or if you encourage that connection, you're enabling them and their families to stay connected. I think that's very valuable, and that's something that we should all learn from many, not all, but many of the Chabad centers and communities and shlichim in Israel and in the world. And in that, I think Kino David is very much that way, and can be a connection with Chabad in that sense. And sometimes some people have complained in or about Kino David that we don't get people to learn and grow more, and to move forward and to become more, strict in their commitment to halakha and things like that. And I absolutely agree that I would love to do that as much as possible. But if I would make that if we would make that the main energy, we might, the blanket is just that large, and if you pull it this way, it's not going to cover that part of the bed. So I'm afraid that if we pull it too much in that direction, we're going to lose on the other side. There are other communities who do that for other people. And if we are significant for people who want the connection without being pressured or criticized about not being committed, then that's also a very valuable action to take. And I believe if there were more communities doing that in the country, there are. I'm not saying we're the only ones, chas v'chalila. But if there were more communities minded to that, it would make a difference in Israeli society. Mark.
I mean, I'm not religious, and yet I feel very, very much at home in the Jewish community that we have in Kinnor David and in Ra'anana and in Israel in general. Why is that? Well, it's a sense of community. It's a sense of being connected. It's a sense of not being made to choose. I have to have this lifestyle in order to have friends, and very important to me. It's quite fundamental, actually. I would add to that my gosh, if one were really very strict, then one would have to apply those criteria uniformly. And because I'm always talking about a spectrum, right? So everybody's somewhere on a spectrum, somewhere in a range. And so if you're defining a very narrow slice, that's the only way to be, then you're losing everybody else. So there's got to be a compromise somewhere. And if you narrow it down very much, then you will lose, a majority of people.
Psychologically, probably, about myself, I teach halakha in Kinnor David at the end of the Tefillah on Shabbat or at other times. And someone once criticized me for doing that because I might be teaching people halakha that they're not going to keep. Better that they shouldn't, that what's called in Hebrew, mutav yu shogegim v'al yu mizidim. It's better that they're shogeg, they don't know that they're making a halachic mistake, then they learn what's right to do and then they don't fulfill it. And I said, well, number one, some people learn it and want to know and they fulfill it. You can't take that away from them. And number two, I need a way, or maybe this is my own need, I need a way to be able to make a statement, even though we're very inclusive, halakha is important for us. We are not shoving it down your throat individually, but we believe that halakha should be kept. You don't want to keep it, you're not going to hear a word of criticism from me individually. But this is what we believe in, and it's a balance of trying to say both at the same time.
And very importantly, it's a mutual respect.
Okay, thank you.
And also, it's personal, but what I appreciate is when you talk about halakha, you give different visions, different ways. So you can or choose anything, or choose this way or that way. And it's very important also for many people, because we are not all the same in the community. So it's important to be able to do something which is relevant for us and which makes sense for us. So it's very appreciable to have these different views and different halachic decision.
אנחנו רק באמצע, בסדר? אנחנו באמצע מוקלט. עוד 10 דקות בערך אנחנו נסיים. I've been criticized for being too lenient. When I said this to my children, they laughed out loud. They said, Kol hakavod, not because it's good to be lenient, because it enables people, and part of giving two opinions is to give, it has two values. One is to give people choice. Not this is halakha, take it or leave it. You have a little bit of flexibility, and maybe you, as an individual, it's more right for you this way or more right for someone else the other way. Also, because there are some people for whom leniency enables them to say, okay, that I can keep. And some people want to be more strict, and they should know that there's a more strict opinion. So give them the options and let them choose. But also it's planned. I always say there's one person who jokingly said to me, every time you say a lenient opinion, I take that one. And he thought he was telling me, oh, that's so funny. I always take the lenient opinion. I was dancing I was all joyful and dancing about that. I got him to keep the more lenient opinion. That's great. It's not because he was being more strict before, and now he became more lenient, because now he had an opinion that he could choose. So That's also part of what can make it happen. That's okay. Tova, you wanted to say something, and then Eliezer. Tova, you're on mute.
You're right. Thank you. I wanted to say that we are going back to this topic that we already discussed. The educational system in Israel must be changed. The non-religious one must be changed. Something has to be done so that the kids that are from non-religious schools don't get out of school knowing nothing about Judaism. It doesn't make any sense. They teach them about other cultures, but not about Judaism. They don't have to follow, but they have to know. There's a difference.
I can't agree with you more on the one hand, but on the other hand, it's not only the schools, it's the society.
Yep.
The society would be open to knowing and letting children decide what they want to keep and being inclusive from all ends and positions. You're not, not you individually. If a person is not religious and their children study something about religion and want to keep 1%, and they're afraid of having them learn because they're going to get to keep a few percent, and God forbid, maybe they're going to become Baalei Tshuva, then they're not being inclusive, just like the other extreme is not being inclusive. One of the people who has had success in influencing in this way is Micha Gudman, who created one of the non-religious mechinot for post-high school before tzava. And he says in the first years, when the kids would come from non-religious background, homes and schools, and sit in a Beit Midrash and study Judaism, and his idea was absolutely not to make them Baalei Tshuva, to make them more knowledgeable and connected.
Right.
And when they had a parents' day, the parents come and visit, said the parents came and they were so suspicious and so cautious and so wary, what is he doing to our children? Because they were afraid that their children were studying Judaism and where is it going to take them? And, after a few years, I think they saw that they can have a more Jewish connection and they don't have to become strictly religious. So still the fear is still there in the society, and there are some people, some Orthodox Jews with very good intentions, but I think make big mistakes and keep the tension so high that it's hard to get people who are not religious to study Judaism because they're afraid that you're being aggressive and shoving it down their throats.
But is it right for the parents to make such a choice for their children?
Okay, but I'm saying in order to bring about the change in the schools, I think there are a lot of people around the country who have to make changes, and not only they tell them to change the schools, a lot of other changes have to happen in order to make them open them up to being able to accept that.
Classes for adults.
Yes.
Eliezer.
First of all, very short comment about Mark's continuum. I think it's actually a closed continuum. That's more like a wheel that people jump from one extreme to another extreme just as easily as they move a little bit. But I wanted to bring up the point that conservatism isn't the same as the American conservatism. It's not the same as the Israeli Masorti movement.
Mm-hmm.
And so far as the Israeli Masorti movement, as you know from our neighbors, is much more traditional than many of the non-Orthodox synagogues in the States. And concerning continuing, in my experience at least, one of the most important ways of encouraging Jews to marry other Jews is through youth movements, and because they meet other people of similar aspirations, and so to try to shut down non-Orthodox youth movements, I think is a big mistake. I think that all Jewish youth movements should be encouraged as much as possible.
Thank you.
So,
We have to move towards closure. So we have Michael and Ilana, and then maybe I'll add one last comment. B'vakasha, Michael.
so I agree with Eliezer. The big problem that I see certainly in the States, and my question is going to be, are you seeing the same problem in Israel? Is with the reform movement when they chose a few decades ago to change the definition of who is a Jew. And you've got a pretty good percentage now of people that are members of reform temples that are not halakhically Jewish. They have a father who was Jewish, not a mother.
Right.
And they don't wear a badge that says that. And when they go to a summer camp or whatever, they go on birthright programs. They have a right to do that. And they meet somebody
Right.
who, is attracted to them. They're nice people. And down the road, somebody figures out, this one is not halakhically Jewish. It's created, I think, a huge problem. I don't know any way to fix it, but I'm wondering if in the Reform community in Israel, are we seeing that same thing or not?
To some extent, yes, not in the same numbers, smaller numbers. But I think Israel as a state, because of the law of return, does have a lot of that.
Mm-hmm.
And this relates to what we study on Shabbat afternoon before Mincha about conversion. Going back to studying halakha, we've been discussing the halachot of conversion relating to all kinds of questionable conversions, questionable in the sense, mostly in the sense of why is the person converting? Is he sincere? Does he intend to keep mitzvot afterwards? Or does he just want the stamp of being Jewish? And what if it's somewhere in between? If he wants to be more Jewish, but he doesn't intend to keep all the mitzvot and halachot, he doesn't have any such intention, do we accept the conversion or not? And then that raises the question of what is being more stringent and what is being more lenient. Is being stringent about conversion, saying I only take part in, I only encourage, I only help people who want to convert to become totally religious, and others I don't help because they're more stringent. Is that more stringent, or is it keeping us with more non-Jews in the community? Or are there enough halachic opinions that if he converted and made the statement and keeps some of the mitzvot, that can still be accepted as a conversion, and therefore the more stringent thing to do is to accept him as a convert? So this is an ongoing discussion in between different yeshivot and rabbis in the Orthodox, of course, community in Israel today. And I think we take a clear stand on that, but you have to understand the whole question and the basis of the different opinions. There is basis for different opinions, but I think the thing to do about that, at least in Israel, is to try and encourage conversions. And again, we try to do what we can. We've had some success in that. I can't say that Kinor David has had thousands of conversions and we've made the difference in Am Yisrael, but we've had a few. We've encouraged families to take part in that, in being a hosting family for people in their process of conversion. And I think as much of that as we can do is a positive thing.
Nice.
Ilana.
Okay, so something that
In Ivrit, I will say Achrona Chaviva.
Toda rabba. Something in Tova's comments before reminded me of this about my own life. When I was a young teenager, I had a very, very good friend. Her parents were labor Zionists. And I used to go to Habonim meetings with her. And she was going to Habonim camp. And my mother put her foot down and she said, no way will I send you to Habonim camp. You'll become a Zionist and then want to move to Israel. I leave you with that part.
You know,
Okay, so you're a rebel. It's called in Hebrew Amered HaKadosh, the Holy Rebellion.
Yep.
Okay.
Okay, I will end with repeating something I mentioned the last time we met of Moshe Feinstein in his harsh and very strict attitude, mentions that sometimes you do have to take into consideration that if your attitude is going to cause a big machloket, a big separation in the community, there is room to consider being a little softer and more lenient. And I would take that small, short comment of Rav Moshe Feinstein
Mhm.
and turn that into a big projection about his attitude and say that it's causing too much of negative connections and friction between people. And we should learn, just like when we try to be unified, in order to be unified, we have to learn how to argue with one another, because we can't survive
Right.
if every little argument is a giant fight, and we can't live together, and all we can do is yell at one another and demonstrate powerfully against one another, and we can't discuss and argue about our differences of opinions, then we can't be unified. So in the same way, we have to learn how to argue about these issues and
Right.
but at the same time remain brotherly brothers and sisters towards one another. I think that needs strengthening
Right.
as well. I've said that, but I just repeated it again. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much. Good night.
Thank you.
Good night.
Mr. Koch.
Yes.
Laila
Oh.
tov.
Good 2025 to everybody.
Oh, yes.
To you.
Oh, there's the recording.